So let me just then briefly talk about Musar, and then we'll go into the Q&A sessions, Catherine, if that's okay. So Musar was created by my grandfather in 1930. At the time, he decided that he wanted to create a product that was the most premium possible. And if you think of wines made in France, Italy, at the time, 1920s to 1940s or 1930s to 1940s, most of the wines were sold in bulk. Apart from the big Bordeaux wines that we know now, all of it was sold either in barrels or in any different type of other containers. But we decided to just go straight away with bottling. Bottling was the high-end version at the time. And so the whole approach of my grandfather was always to create something that was unique and premium. Um, Fast forward one generation, you get to the early 60s. And that's where my father, Serge, took over from my grandfather. Not easily, actually. The story goes that my grandfather asked my father to join him and help at the winery. My father was an engineer, and my father refused. He was 20 at the time. My grandfather asked the second time, and he got the same answer. And at the third time he asked, my father said, "Okay, I'll come. I'll make the wines, but on the condition that you leave. Not leave as in completely leave the business, but let me do what I believe should be done with the wines." And that was an important time for Mizar because the approach of my father was effectively to move away from all the technology and the new, I guess, control of the wines that was being put in place in the 60s. 60s was the period where all the chemistry of wine, all the fermentation processes, the first fermentation, the malolactic were discovered. And so as those were being discovered, the natural, I guess, natural inclination of people is to try to control things. As soon as you think you know what's happening, you want to control things and make it better. And the approach of my father at the time was to say, okay, we're not going to do any of this. On the contrary, we're going to start really doing nothing to the wines. So my grandfather used to have yeasts for fermentation. So we started having natural fermentation from the 60s onwards, from 1959, actually. My grandfather used to filter and fine the wines. That completely stopped. So a lot of the approach that we call non-interventionist at Musar, where we just tend to the wines rather than make the wines, was the brainchild of my father. In addition, he had a great palate. I mean, he had a sense for taste that was absolutely outstanding. And it took him 17 years to effectively come up with a blend of the different varietals that we use today in our Chateau Musar Red, which is our flagship. He was still experimenting. He started making wine in 59, 60, 61. Then he went to study in Bordeaux, came back and started developing even more his approach. And then in the 70s, he realized that he was making wines that were too close to Bordeaux in style. So he went back to making the wines in the way he used to make them actually before studying wine, just by instinct. And so it's his approach that we still follow today, this approach of really minimalist intervention in our wine. And then in the mid 90s, my brother, our current winemaker, joined my father, learned a lot, I guess, from him, spent 25 years with him before he passed away. 20 years, learning from him, and eventually are now basically my brother oversees all the wine production, and we have our winemaker also who's there, Tarek.